Well, let's talk about, I guess, the rest of these playoffs, all right, and how they worked out, right? You had the first time having a 12-team playoff, okay? I, I, I think for me, it went kind of how I expected it to go. You know, like now some teams won that I didn't. Well, actually, I did say on our buddy Drew Tamu's show that Notre Dame plus 1100 isn't crazy to win national championship based on their bracket, but I mean, we both said we're like, all right, winner of that Tennessee Ohio State game is going to be like kind of a gigantic threat moving forward. You saw like how that first wild card round played out. I think no one was surprised. I mean, all those spreads were like double digit spreads, and they all ended up being double digit point victories for the winner. So like people were like, oh my gosh, always blood. It's like that's kind of what you expected, right? Is what is. In some years you might not have that, right? In some years, if you have 10-point spreads, right, that's an implied probability. One of those teams generally is going to lose. That's the favorite. Generally, it just didn't happen this year, right? Based on implied probabilities of a 10-point spread. Uh, I guess like the seeding, I think definitely needs to be changed. I know everyone's talking about that. I'm assuming that they'll probably change that moving forward. I don't know how fast they're going to be changing that. Uh,
So,
but
so
yeah,
they met real quick to that point. So they
sure.
met, I believe. I don't know if it was in Atlanta, but this past weekend for the national title game to assess like any changes that they're going to make to it in 2025, and they did not say anything about changing seating because I think you also have like it needs to be unanimous, right, for that to happen. And if you're at the ACC, if you're the Mountain West, like all these other, like you're not going to want to change it. So that's a big part of it. And then they also talked about how awesome the atmospheres were in the first round of these home games, and what they don't know exactly what's going to happen. And I think figuring out what to do with those bowl games, those BCS bowl games, and those venues and all those ties, it's going to be tough. But they did talk about wanting to explore options of having more home games, which I think is freaking awesome.
See, I think that because of those bowls, right? Like the Cotton Bowls, like they're not gonna like. There's so much money had around these bowl game, like in these venues and like these towns. Like they're not gonna let these bowl games be played somewhere else. I would see it expanding to 16 before I see it, you know, the second round. And should the second round be home games? Yeah, because if you host a bye, you don't even get to host a playoff game. You know, it's stupid. You know, what's the point of the bye? You know, if you don't even get to have a home playoff game, it's ridiculous. But yeah, and then we talked about it like how many times it's like, and you hear other pundits, saying similar things, right? Like what the 12-team playoff does, it gives an opportunity for lesser teams to play on a national stage for a shot at a championship, but it also gives teams like Ohio State or Alabama that have 2 losses or 3 losses a chance to get in and win, right? Despite making, so I guess if you want to have the argument about like, if you want the best team to win, in college football, this is probably a really good way to do it. You have probably a team playing the best football at the time. It's probably going to end up winning the national championship pretty much every time now with this format. If you want the most deserving team, right, maybe the 4-team playoff or the BCS was your cup of tea, right? So I still think it's interesting how we evaluate strength of schedule. I do think that needs to be looked at, and I don't know the right answer for that, but I don't necessarily think the playoff committee got it wrong. By the way, I think the playoff committee actually got it right. But I do think that looking at strength of schedule, you need to be able to define what strength of schedule is. Like, what does that mean? What makes one team? And it's hard because everyone's playing against each other. So how do you, I've always thought like the basketball does a pretty good job of it. Despite like all the arguments that you have about teams in the bubble and stuff, because there still ultimately is a committee that makes decisions. But yeah, I think like if you had quadrants, I think it could better quantify because like the top 25 ranked team, right? Like rankings 1 through 5, right, are drastically better than the teams 10 through 20, 10 through 25, drastically. But the teams from 10 to 25, right, and then the teams from 25 to 40, I don't think there's as big of a gap between those. Like your top 35 teams in the country, your top 30 teams in the country, they arbitrarily picked the number 25, and I don't know why, but I don't know. I think the quadrant system could work if you evaluated it instead of looking at top 25 wins. Because first of all, top 25, I don't know. This is a whole conversation we could have, but what does top 25 mean, right? Oh, a bunch of people that don't watch college football voted for this team because they saw the box score. Great. Awesome. I don't know. Just opinions that I have, and I feel like this is a good time to share them. But I do think I liked the 12-team playoff more than I thought I would.
Yes.
In
I
some
think
ways.
it served its purpose. Now, I do think the drawbacks, like, and something we talked about, like two of the biggest upsets in college football this year in the regular season was NIU being Notre Dame and Michigan being Ohio State, and it ended up not
Not
really
mattering
mattering.
at
Right
all.
now that they both got in. Now I do think like that hurt your margin for error, right? So if you're Notre Dame and you lose again, right? Maybe you lose, or you get a lower seed, whatever it may be. And if you're Ohio State, you didn't have a first round bye, you didn't have whatever, yada yada yada. I get that, but it is a little bit of a shame, right? But the reality, go back to your AP top 25. Like if you go back to week one rankings, right, in top 25, generally they do a pretty good job of getting like some of the top teams right. Like you had Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, Ole Miss, Notre Dame, Penn State. Those teams were all in the top 8. But you also had Michigan at 9, right? Florida State at 10, Utah at 12, right? LSU, Oklahoma. These are all teams in the top 20, right? That are objectively not very good football teams. And like again, like those would count as top 25 wins. And like the quad system is really interesting. They'd have to do it right, and I think it shouldn't be the end all be all, but it could be a statistic to look at that would make more sense than just like wins against teams with more than 6 wins. Whatever that stupid
Yeah.
ESPN stat is interesting. I do want to go back to like right the
Also, like
seeding.
the net rankings, like in basketball, like, and I felt this way about Indiana. Indiana kicked the shit out of the teams that they beat. Kicked the shit out of them, and that matters. They didn't play a great schedule, but they absolutely handled business. Right. I think that matters too. Like in the net rankings of basketball, that matters. Like a
Yeah,
20-point win against a quad two team is solid. It means as much as, maybe not as much, but it means something. Like as not as much necessarily as like a 1-point win over a quad one, but it means something, right?
yeah.
I don't know.
I
Just
mean,
my
then
thoughts.
you're getting into the BCS era in terms of like having a computer system and all these other
Computerized,
things,
yeah,
but which I
which was
think is
awesome.
also like having subjective parts, right? Where you've got like your humans on the committee making decisions, but then also your objective parts where you have objective facts to look at, like the net is very interesting. I want to go back to the seating here. So if I kind of go back to this, and if you ask me like teams that got screwed, right? Like Oregon, yeah, probably got screwed, but whatever, you got blown out. Like that's kind of your own fault. You didn't show up for that game. But like Indiana, right, is a team that went 11-1 and had their only loss was on the road against
To the
the best
national
team in
champion.
the national champion, and they had to play the
Actually, they
runner
lost to
ups.
the two teams. The only two losses were two teams that played in the national championship.
Exactly. In their first game, they went 11-1 in the Big Ten, right? Who was the best conference in college football. I think we can all say that now,
Yep,
right? Maybe not like top to bottom, whatever. Like it was the best conference. However you want to metric
at the
that,
top
whatever.
end, yes. At the playoff level, the playoff level teams, yes, yes.
Yeah, but I also think like you had the best team. You had a bunch of yeah, whatever. They also like you had Michigan and India and South and Illinois like win against other teams and other conferences. But so Indiana, right, for going 11-1 in the Big Ten, right, and only loss being on the road to the best team in the country, you had to play the national champion runner up on the road, right, in that first round, where you had teams like, Clemson going on the road to Austin. You had um, Boise State having a bye, having to play Penn State, in Glendale, Arizona, and then you had Arizona State having a bye, playing Texas, and like everyone wants to talk about a lot of the teams, people getting screwed like Alabama and South Carolina and Ole Miss and Miami, yada yada. I think like Indiana would be a team that like I'm looking back and I'm like I would have loved to see them play multiple playoff games because the only two times we saw them play like quote unquote real opponents, it was the two best teams in the country, right? And so like I don't know. I again like strength
But
of
we didn't
schedule,
we
like you
didn't
said.
know, like Notre Dame's season. Their power rating was not complete. It was incomplete. right? Like you were
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
going to power rate Texas and Georgia for that matter, like they did. Penn State, like you were probably gonna like before Notre Dame was winning those games, like you were probably gonna power rate 6 or 7 teams in the college football playoffs over Notre Dame at the
yes.
time.
Well, yeah, and I'm not doubting that. And that's also the reason why they were number 5. They lost to NIU for God's sakes. But like, it's just like in hindsight, you're like Indiana kind of got screwed. Now they did get lucky in terms of like the schedule they played in the Big Ten, right? But they also earned their way to the playoffs, and they had to play, one of the toughest first round games. Tennessee is also in that hat too, where I also was not a fan of Tennessee for a long time. Like I didn't think they were very good, and they had to go on the road and play Columbus because Ohio State lost to Michigan, right, and didn't get a
Yeah,
bye week, and so you get screwed there. So I think something we do have to realize too is it's a 1 year sample size. It's a super, super small sample. This is a drastic change to college football, and people are learning and figuring out. Now, are there like things that should be fixed and like could be fixed? I think everyone realizes, yeah, that's not right. Yeah, absolutely. But I think we should wait and see how this thing plays out over multiple years because things will like even out, as they say, right? As the more you do, the more sample size you get, it will even out. This is just one sample size. This is one outcome of many outcomes that could have happened with this own scenario. Like what would have happened, if Texas scores on that last drive, right? And goes, what would have happened if Arizona State gets a stop on 4th and 13? Or what would have happened if Indiana doesn't throw that interception in that first round, that first game? What happens if SMU doesn't turn the ball over 5 times in that first half? And it changes outcomes of games. What happens if Georgia's quarterback didn't get hurt and like this was one outcome of many outcomes of just one sample size, if that makes sense. I know it's kind of backwards way, but I don't know. Before we go and freak out and flip out and like college football is ending and it's over and my team will never have a chance to win the title. First of all, your team probably doesn't have a chance to win the title as it
yeah,
was.
that's
And there's like
facts, literally
15
facts.
teams every year that could probably win a title, right? And it's probably gotten smaller. Winning a title is probably harder now to do than ever. Like we just saw here, having to play 3 or 4 games against quality opponents. Yeah, I don't know. Just sit back and enjoy it. Now, the one thing I do want to make sure stays the same, and we will do a good job covering on this channel, is bowl season and the regular season. And like to your point that this championship game was actually a competitive one, and most of them aren't, is more proving to the fact that this sport is not about crowning a champion. It is more about the journey. It is about every team having rivals in conference games and having, 12 opportunities to play in a season,
Traditions.
traditions. And that's why we love college football. It's not about who's winning the championship. Like that's a big deal and it should be, but it's not the end all be all. And it's not even the most important thing in our sport. And that's the beauty of it. So these money makers at the top end, they're and granted, like I can't blame them because they're trying to make money and that's their job too, and they got families to feed and they got all this stuff. But there's so much emphasis put on the playoffs and the national championship game. But the reality is, and it shows in viewership, it shows in other things that like people care about other things in the sport, and I think sometimes you can lose sight of that. And so there's my soapbox I wanted to step up on and kind of bring that down. But yeah,
No, that's very fair. You made valid points, every single one of them, and I don't want to argue with it.